My beloved child. Stop scrolling for just a moment. Do not move past this message yet. Something is waiting for you inside these words, and the timing of this message is more important than you realize. What you are about to hear was meant to find you at a moment when your heart may have been asking questions that no one around you could answer. There is something happening behind the scenes. Someone connected to your heart has recently received news about you, and the moment they heard it, something inside them changed. They did not expect to hear your name in that conversation. They did not expect the information to reach them. And most importantly, they did not expect the truth to affect them as deeply as it did. My beloved child, listen carefully. This is not a message about punishment. It is not a message designed to frighten you. It is a fictional spiritual story meant to remind you that sometimes people realize the value of something only when they believe they may lose it. And your soulmate is beginning to understand something they should have understood much earlier. They thought they had time. They thought you would always be there. They thought your silence meant you had stopped caring. They thought the distance between you was permanent. But then something happened. A message arrived. A conversation took place. A piece of information was revealed. And suddenly, the person who had been trying to control their emotions could no longer control them. They were shaken. Not because someone attacked them. Not because someone threatened them. But because they heard something about you that forced them to confront a possibility they had been desperately avoiding. The possibility that your life was moving forward without them. Pause here for a moment. Because the most important part has not even been revealed. Your soulmate did not receive ordinary news. They received news that made them question everything they believed about your current situation. They heard that something had changed. Something important. Something personal. Something connected to the future they once imagined with you. And when they heard it, their first reaction was disbelief. No. That was the word that came out of them. They tried to reject it. They tried to convince themselves that the person speaking must have misunderstood. They asked questions. Then they asked more questions. They wanted details. They wanted confirmation. They wanted to know exactly where the information had come from. And when the answer came, their expression changed. Because deep inside, they already knew there was truth in it. They had sensed that you were changing. They had felt your energy becoming different. They had noticed that you were no longer reaching for them the way you once did. They had noticed that you were becoming quieter. Stronger. More distant. More difficult to read. And perhaps they had secretly believed that you were simply waiting for them. But they were wrong. You were not waiting. You were healing. There is a difference. A person who is waiting keeps looking backward. A person who is healing begins to look toward tomorrow. And somewhere along your journey, something inside you began to shift. You stopped begging for explanations. You stopped demanding answers. You stopped chasing someone who could not decide whether they wanted to stay. You began choosing peace. You began protecting your heart. You began realizing that love should not require you to destroy yourself just to prove that you care. Your soulmate noticed this change, but they misunderstood it. They thought you were becoming cold. They thought you were trying to punish them. They thought you were pretending not to care. They never understood that sometimes silence is not revenge. Sometimes silence is survival. And now they are facing the consequences of all the moments when they assumed you would remain exactly where they left you. My beloved child, something happened recently that brought your name back into their world. Maybe it was a person they encountered. Maybe it was a message. Maybe it was an unexpected conversation. Maybe someone showed them something they had never seen before. But whatever the doorway was, your name entered that conversation. And when it did, their heart reacted before their mind could protect itself. They became still. They listened. They did not interrupt. They did not know what to say. Because the person speaking to them had information that reached deeper than ordinary gossip. It was something that made them realize that your life had entered a chapter they were not prepared for. And that is where the devastating part begins. They were told that you may no longer be emotionally available in the way they assumed. They were told that you had begun releasing the attachment. They were told that you were considering a completely different future. And when they heard that, their breathing changed. They tried to hide it. But they could not. Their hands became restless. Their thoughts started racing. They replayed old memories. They remembered conversations with you. They remembered the moments they ignored your feelings. They remembered every time you reached out and they responded too late. Every time they wanted to say something but remained silent. Every time fear convinced them to step backward. Every time pride prevented them from stepping forward. And suddenly, all those moments returned at once. They realized something painful. They had been protecting themselves from rejection while accidentally creating the very distance they were afraid of. They were afraid you would leave. So they pulled away. They were afraid they would become vulnerable. So they acted indifferent. They were afraid of what other people might say. So they listened to everyone except their own heart. And now the person they were trying so hard not to lose may be the very person they pushed away. Stop scrolling if you feel something in your heart right now. Because this story is about to become deeper. The news they received was not simply that you were moving on. There was another part. A part they were not prepared to hear. Someone told them that you had changed in a way they might never be able to reverse. You were no longer waiting for an apology to begin your life. You were no longer waiting for them to choose you before choosing yourself. You were no longer measuring your worth according to whether they came back. And that terrified them. Because they had secretly believed that your love was permanent regardless of how they behaved. They believed there would always be another chance. Another conversation. Another night. Another message. Another opportunity to explain. But suddenly, the possibility of another chance no longer felt guaranteed. And that realization hit them harder than anything else. They went somewhere alone after hearing the news. They needed silence. They needed to process it. They sat down and stared at their phone. Your name was there. They could have contacted you. Their fingers moved toward the screen. Then stopped. They opened your conversation. They read old messages. Some were short. Some were emotional. Some may have seemed ordinary when they were first written. But now every word carried a different weight. They read something you had once said and suddenly understood what you had really meant. They remembered a question you had asked them. At the time, they had avoided answering. Now they wished they could go back. They remembered your patience. They remembered your kindness. They remembered how you tried to understand them even when they gave you reasons not to. And for the first time, they wondered whether the person they had been searching for in other places had been standing in front of them all along. That thought broke something open inside them. But then came the most painful memory. The moment when you finally stopped trying. They remembered the last time you reached out. They remembered the way you waited. They remembered how you eventually became quiet. And they suddenly realized that your silence had not begun because you stopped loving them. Your silence began because you stopped believing they would choose you. That realization left them shaking. They put the phone down. Picked it up again. Put it down. They wanted to call. They wanted to hear your voice. They wanted to ask whether it was true. But fear stopped them. What if you did not answer? What if you answered and sounded completely different? What if you told them you had already moved on? What if you said that you no longer wanted what you once wanted? That possibility terrified them more than they expected. Because they had prepared themselves for the possibility of losing you someday. They had never prepared themselves for the possibility that you could genuinely become okay without them. And now they were beginning to see it. You were becoming okay. You were beginning to smile again. You were rebuilding parts of yourself they never knew had been broken. You were learning to enjoy moments without checking whether they were watching. You were learning to sleep without waiting for a message. You were learning that unanswered questions do not have to become permanent wounds. And while you were quietly healing, they were quietly realizing what your absence meant. There is something deeply mysterious about timing. Sometimes two people meet before they are ready. Sometimes love arrives before wisdom. Sometimes the heart recognizes someone long before the mind understands what that recognition means. And sometimes people separate because they need to become different versions of themselves before they can understand the connection they once shared. That is why this fictional spiritual message is not telling you to chase your soulmate. It is telling you to understand your own transformation. Because the biggest revelation in this story is not what happened to them. It is what happened to you. You survived the season when you thought you would not. You survived the unanswered messages. You survived the nights when you wondered whether you were enough. You survived the moments when you blamed yourself for someone else's inability to communicate. You survived the silence. And now the person who once thought you would always be emotionally available is discovering that your heart has boundaries. That is why the news devastated them. Not because something terrible happened to you. But because they suddenly understood that you were no longer standing at the same emotional door. They looked back toward that door. And you were not there. They looked again. Still nothing. And for the first time, they understood what absence really meant. My beloved child, there is another layer. The person who delivered the news did not tell them everything immediately. They paused. They watched your soulmate's reaction. Then they said something that made the entire room feel different. They told them that you had been carrying something silently. Something your soulmate never knew. A private struggle. A hidden disappointment. A decision you had been considering for a long time. And when your soulmate heard this, they became completely still. Because suddenly, memories began rearranging themselves. They remembered moments when you looked tired. They remembered times when you said you were fine even though you were not. They remembered when you disappeared for a while. They remembered when you became unusually quiet. And they realized they had mistaken your pain for distance. They had mistaken your exhaustion for indifference. They had mistaken your silence for anger. They never understood how much you were carrying. And now they were hearing that you had reached a point where you were finally choosing yourself. The thought devastated them. They whispered your name. Not loudly. Almost like they were afraid saying it too loudly would make the reality more painful. Your name carried memories. Your smile. Your voice. Your little habits. The things they once found ordinary. The things they never realized they would miss. And suddenly, ordinary memories became precious. They remembered the way you laughed at something insignificant. They remembered the way you looked at them when you wanted them to understand something without saying it. They remembered the moments when you were vulnerable. And they realized that they had received pieces of your heart without fully understanding their value. Now those pieces were no longer being offered. That is what shook them. Not the idea of another person. Not jealousy. Not competition. The possibility that they had lost access to the version of you who once loved them without conditions. They sat in silence for a long time. Then they asked the question they had been afraid to ask. Is it too late? No one answered immediately. And that silence was more powerful than any answer. Because sometimes the hardest truth is not that something is over. It is that you no longer know whether it can be repaired. Your soulmate suddenly realized that love alone cannot erase every wound. Love cannot automatically restore trust. Love cannot force someone to reopen a door they had to close for their own peace. Love can inspire a person to change. But change must be proven. And they knew that if they ever came toward you again, words would not be enough. They would have to come differently. They would have to come honestly. They would have to stop hiding behind fear. They would have to stop allowing other people to make decisions for their heart. And that was frightening. Because it meant they could no longer remain undecided. They would have to choose. And choosing you would require them to confront everything that had kept them away. Family pressure. Fear. Pride. Past wounds. Other people's opinions. Their own insecurities. All of it. For a long time, they had convinced themselves that the problem was circumstances. Now they were beginning to realize that the greater problem had been their own hesitation. And the news about you forced them to confront it. My beloved child, there is a moment in every great spiritual story when the person who has been running finally stops. Your soulmate reached that moment. They stopped running. They stopped pretending. They stopped telling themselves that they did not care. And what they discovered beneath all those defenses was something they had been trying to bury. They still cared. Deeply. More deeply than they had admitted to anyone. Perhaps even more deeply than they had admitted to themselves. But there was one thing they did not know. They did not know whether you still cared. That uncertainty became unbearable. They began wondering about your days. Who were you talking to? What were you thinking about? Were you happier now? Did you still remember them? Did their names still make your heart pause? Or had you finally reached the point where their memory was nothing more than a chapter you had already closed? Every question led to another. And the more they wondered, the more they realized how little they truly knew about your current life. You had become a mystery to them. And that mystery was created by the very distance they once chose. They wanted information. But they also feared what they might discover. Then came another revelation. Someone told them that you had recently made a decision. A serious one. A decision that could change the direction of your future. Their face changed instantly. What decision? They asked. The answer did not come immediately. There was hesitation. And that hesitation made their heart beat faster. Because they knew, whatever the decision was, it was important. They were told that you had finally decided to stop putting your life on hold. And those words hit them like a wave. Stop putting your life on hold. They repeated them silently. Because they suddenly understood. You had not been waiting forever. You had simply been waiting until you were strong enough to move forward. And now you were strong. The person who once waited for someone else to make a choice had finally made a choice for themselves. Your soulmate's hands began trembling. They looked away. They did not want anyone to see the emotion on their face. But it was already too late. Their eyes had changed. Their breathing had changed. Their entire posture had changed. They were no longer hearing a story about you. They were confronting their own consequences. And then the person speaking said something even more unexpected. They said that there was still one thing your soulmate did not know. Something about you. Something that had not yet been revealed. Something that could completely change the way they understood everything that had happened between you. Your soulmate looked up. What don't I know? The room became quiet. The answer was delayed. And in that delay, their imagination became louder than reality. They thought of every possibility. They thought perhaps you had met someone. Perhaps you were leaving. Perhaps you had made a life-changing decision. Perhaps you had stopped loving them. Perhaps you had finally accepted that the relationship could never become what you once hoped. Then came the words. You need to hear this from someone who knows the whole story. Your soulmate froze. Because suddenly they understood that there had been another side to your story they had never heard. A side hidden behind your silence. A side buried beneath all the things you never said. And now someone was about to open that door. The person began explaining. They told your soulmate that there was a reason you had become distant. A reason you had stopped asking questions. A reason you had stopped fighting. A reason you had started protecting your heart. And when they heard the reason, their eyes filled with emotion. Because it was not what they expected. They had assumed you were angry. You were not. They had assumed you were trying to make them jealous. You were not. They had assumed you wanted attention. You did not. You had simply become exhausted from carrying a love that felt one-sided. That truth devastated them. Because they realized you had not walked away suddenly. You had been walking away slowly. Quietly. One disappointment at a time. One unanswered question at a time. One broken expectation at a time. And they had not noticed. Or perhaps they had noticed but refused to acknowledge it. Either way, the result was the same. You had reached a place where your heart needed peace more than it needed answers. Your soulmate covered their face with their hands. For a moment, they looked completely defeated. Then they said something that revealed just how deeply this affected them. I thought they knew. The person asked, knew what? Your soulmate became silent. And then they finally admitted it. I thought they knew I loved them. But the tragedy was that love had remained hidden behind behavior that did not look like love. They felt it. But you experienced their absence. They felt afraid. But you experienced their silence. They cared. But you experienced their hesitation. And sometimes what a person feels inside cannot heal what their actions create outside. That was the lesson they were finally learning. My beloved child, if you are still listening, understand what this fictional story is trying to tell your heart. Never measure your worth by someone's inability to recognize it. Never assume that someone else's confusion means you are unworthy of clarity. Never believe that another person's fear is proof that you are difficult to love. Sometimes people run from what they deeply desire because receiving something precious requires them to become vulnerable. And vulnerability terrifies people who have spent their lives protecting themselves. Your soulmate was one of those people. They were not necessarily heartless. They were afraid. But fear does not erase consequences. And now they were facing those consequences. The news they received forced them to see what their fear had cost them. It cost them moments. It cost them trust. It cost them opportunities. It cost them your presence. And perhaps the greatest cost was that they did not realize what they were losing until you had already begun rebuilding your life. The night grew quieter. They remained alone with their thoughts. The phone was still in their hand. Your conversation was still open. They typed a sentence. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Finally, they wrote your name. Only your name. They stared at it. Their finger hovered over the send button. Then they stopped. Because something inside them said, what if they don't want to hear from you anymore? That question broke them. They realized they could no longer assume your heart belonged to them. They had never asked for permanent ownership. But somewhere along the way, they had behaved as though your love would remain available no matter how long they disappeared. Now they understood. Love can wait. But love can also heal. And when love heals, it may no longer wait in the same place. That thought terrified them. They put the phone down. Then picked it up again. This time, they did not type. They simply looked at your name. And whispered something they had never had the courage to say directly. I'm sorry. Maybe you never heard those words. Maybe you were sleeping. Maybe you were somewhere completely unaware of what was happening. But in that moment, they finally said them. Not to impress you. Not to manipulate you. Not because anyone told them to. They said them because they finally understood. And then came the moment that changed everything. Another message arrived. The same person who had delivered the devastating news sent one final piece of information. Your soulmate opened it. Read the first sentence. Stopped. Read it again. Their face went completely pale. They stood up. The phone nearly slipped from their hand. Because the message revealed something about your future that they had never imagined. Something that meant the decision you had made was much bigger than simply moving on. It meant you were stepping into a new chapter. A chapter where the person who had once been at the center of your emotional world might no longer have a place unless they were willing to become completely honest. Your soulmate stared at the screen. Their heart was racing. They wanted to know everything. But the final sentence of the message was the one that left them shaking. It said that before you made this decision, you had discovered something too. Something about them. Something they had kept hidden. Something they believed you would never find out. Your soulmate read that sentence again. And suddenly, all the fear returned. Because they realized this was not only a story about what they had heard about you. It was also a story about what you may have already discovered about them. Their hands began trembling again. They whispered your name. And for the first time, they understood that the next conversation between you would not be ordinary. There would be no pretending. No hiding. No convenient excuses. No carefully chosen half-truths. If they came to you, they would have to tell you everything. And if you came face to face, they knew there was one question you might ask that they had spent months avoiding. A question they were terrified to answer. A question that could either open the door to a completely different future, or finally close the chapter they had been too afraid to end. They looked at your name one last time. Their finger moved toward the call button. They stopped. Moved again. Stopped. Then they took a deep breath. And just before they pressed it, another notification appeared. This one was from someone they never expected to hear from. They opened it. Read the first few words. And suddenly, they realized the devastating news they had received about you was only the beginning. Because the message contained a revelation that connected your past, their silence, and the one secret neither of you had been ready to confront. Their face changed. Their eyes filled with tears. And they whispered. No, they can't know that. But somewhere deep inside, they already knew. You were closer to the truth than they ever imagined. And what happened next would force both of you to confront the one thing neither of you had been brave enough to say out loud. The call was still waiting. Your name was still on their screen. Their hand was still shaking. And then, finally, they pressed the button. But what they heard on the other end was not your voice. It was someone else's. And the first sentence that person spoke made your soulmate realize that the devastating news about you was connected to a secret that had been hidden for far longer than either of you knew. They listened. Their eyes widened. Their breathing stopped for a moment. Then the voice said your name. And after that came the words that changed everything. My beloved child, there are truths that arrive only when your heart is finally strong enough to survive them. And the truth your soulmate is about to hear will not only explain why you were separated, it will reveal who was standing between you all along. The line went silent. Your soulmate could not speak. Because the next name they heard was the last name they ever expected. And that name was connected to the very person who had been influencing their decisions from the beginning. The person they trusted. The person they never questioned. The person who had always told them to stay away from you. And now, for the first time, they were about to discover why. My beloved child. The name they heard on that call was the name of the person they had trusted most. For several seconds, your soulmate could not breathe normally. Their mind refused to accept what their ears had just heard. The voice on the other end continued softly. They were the one who convinced your soulmate to stay away. They were the one who kept telling them that you were not ready, that you did not truly care, and that walking away would protect everyone involved. Your soulmate closed their eyes. Memories suddenly came rushing back. Every warning. Every doubt. Every moment they had decided not to contact you because someone had convinced them it was better that way. It suddenly made sense. The strange timing. The misunderstandings. The messages that never reached you. The opportunities that somehow disappeared. The conversations that always ended in confusion. Someone had been standing between you. And your soulmate had never realized it. Their voice trembled. Why would they do that? The answer came quietly. Because they were afraid of what would happen if you two discovered the truth. Your soulmate's heart sank. What truth? There was a long silence. Then the voice said something that changed everything. They knew that your connection was real long before either of you understood it. Your soulmate stared at the floor. Suddenly, the devastation they had felt earlier became something different. It became anger. Not anger toward you. Anger toward the manipulation. Anger toward the years of confusion. Anger toward every moment they had allowed someone else's opinion to become louder than their own heart. They remembered how often they had wanted to contact you. How many times they had almost returned. And each time, that same person had stopped them. Don't go back. Let it go. They've moved on. You'll only hurt yourself. Now every sentence sounded different. They realized they had not been making completely free choices. They had been making choices based on information that was never complete. And then came the hardest realization. You had also been receiving incomplete information. You had believed they did not care. They had believed you did not care. Two hearts were hurting separately because someone had made sure neither could see the whole picture. Your soulmate sat down. Tears finally fell. They whispered your name. I should have asked them. That sentence carried years of regret. They should have asked you directly. They should have trusted the connection instead of rumors. They should have given you the chance to speak. But they could not change the past. They could only decide what to do next. And this time, they chose differently. They called you. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Your soulmate almost ended the call. Then you answered. For a moment, neither of you spoke. There was only silence. Then your voice came through. Hello? Your soulmate closed their eyes. Hearing your voice after so much time nearly broke them. They tried to speak, but nothing came out. Finally, they whispered. It's me. You knew immediately. Your heart began racing. But you did not say what they expected. You did not accuse them. You did not cry. You simply asked. Why are you calling now? That question stopped them. Because there was no easy answer. They could have blamed circumstances. They could have blamed other people. They could have blamed fear. But they knew you deserved honesty. So they told you everything. They told you about the conversation. They told you about the person who had influenced them. They told you about the warnings. They told you about the devastating news they had received about you. And then they admitted the truth they had hidden for so long. I never stopped caring about you. You remained silent. They continued. I was afraid. I thought staying away would protect me. I thought I had more time. I thought you'd always be there. Your voice became softer. But I was hurt. Those 4 words destroyed the last wall inside them. "I know," they whispered. And for the first time, there was no defense. No excuse. No pride. Only honesty. You told them how their silence had changed you. How you had waited. How you had eventually stopped waiting. How you had learned to choose yourself. They listened. They did not interrupt. And that was the moment something changed between you. Not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because, finally, the truth had entered the room. Your soulmate asked one question. "Is it too late?" You took a long breath. And your answer was not the simple yes or no they feared. You said, "I don't know." They closed their eyes. But strangely, those words gave them hope. Because, "I don't know," meant the door was not necessarily closed. It meant there was something left to understand. You told them that if they wanted another chance, they could not return as the same person who had walked away. They would have to return honestly. Without secrets. Without outside influence. Without fear controlling every decision. Your soulmate agreed. Then came the final revelation. You told them that you had also discovered the truth about the person who had stood between you. You knew. You had known for longer than they realized. And you had been waiting to see whether your soulmate would ever discover it on their own. Silence filled the call. Then your soulmate whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" You answered. "Because I needed to know whether you would believe me when I finally spoke." That sentence stayed with them. Because they understood. Love could not be built on one person constantly proving the truth while the other person constantly doubted it. Trust had to become mutual. And in that moment, your soulmate made a promise. Not a dramatic promise. Not an empty declaration. A simple one. "I will never let someone else make decisions about us again." You did not immediately say yes. You simply said, "Then show me." And that was the beginning. Not the ending. The beginning of something more honest. The devastating news had shaken your soulmate because they believed they were losing you. But what they ultimately discovered was something far more important. They were not being asked to chase you. They were being asked to become worthy of the truth. And you were not being asked to abandon your boundaries. You were being reminded that your healing had value. My beloved child, remember this fictional story whenever you feel tempted to question your worth because someone failed to recognize it. Someone else's delay does not reduce your value. Someone else's confusion does not define your future. And someone's fear does not mean you were unworthy of love. Sometimes people understand what they had only after distance forces them to see clearly. But whether they return or not, your journey must continue. You were never created to remain frozen in yesterday. You were meant to grow. To heal. To become stronger. To choose peace. And if 2 people are truly meant to meet again, they must meet as 2 people who have learned, not as 2 wounded people repeating the same cycle. That night, after the call ended, your soulmate remained awake for hours. But this time, they were not shaking from fear. They were shaking from realization. They finally understood the truth. The person they had been trying to protect themselves from losing was never truly the enemy. The enemy had always been fear, silence, assumptions, and the voices that became louder than their own hearts. And as the first light of morning appeared, your soulmate looked at your name on their phone. They smiled through their tears. Then they whispered the words they should have said long ago. "I finally understand." And somewhere far away, you were beginning your own new morning. You did not know exactly what the future would bring. But for the first time, you were not afraid of it. Because whatever happened next, you knew one thing for certain. You had found your way back to yourself. And that was the greatest revelation of all. Not that your soulmate had returned. Not that the truth had finally been exposed, but that you had stopped abandoning yourself while waiting for someone else to choose you. Now, if love returned, it would have to meet you where you stood. With honesty. With courage. With action. And with peace. The chapter of confusion was over. The chapter of truth had begun. And this time, neither of you would be walking blindly.